The servicemen and women who returned from World War II had promises to keep. The mates they left behind and their families here wanted this to be a country where all men could earn decent wages and raise a family. A country where there was a job for everyone who was able to work. The first, most important objective of post-war economic policy was full employment. Despite the ups and downs of export markets or fluctuating oil prices, successive governments achieved that. They restricted imports to protect new industries, created work schemes in the public service, and borrowed for industrial investment or to keep things going until times improved. For nearly 40 years, the promise of full employment was kept. The price was central economic control. The reward was a wide spread of work and wealth. It seemed a fair deal in a land of plenty.
The 1950s, 60s and early 70s is often described as the period of the decent society in New Zealand, where there was a belief that everyone had the right to participate and belong in the society. And that meant that people had a fundamental right to a job, because you couldn't afford a welfare state, you couldn't afford the sorts of services that people expected unless it was backed by full employment. But full employment was also a part of a decent society, a recognition that having a job was a part of being a part of the community.
The early 1980s brought new young leaders who hadn't lived through the Depression and the Second World War.
I think there is a period of renewal going on, whether it's inspired by the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, I wouldn't be sure. But yes, there's been a certain turnover in the Policy Council, there's been a bit of turnover on the executive and the other positions. We've got a new group coming into Parliament. We're renewing ourselves all the time.
For some of them, the constraints needed to sustain full employment seemed old-fashioned. The ideas of free market economists seemed new and exciting.
You're the party's leading proponent of a more markets economic approach. Can you honestly say that the party is moving in that direction?
In some areas, I'm certain that the party is moving in that direction. In other areas, I think we probably take a more traditional approach. But, a lot of the policies have yet to be announced, so I certainly couldn't say with any certainty that one is moving in one particular direction or another.
In 1984, the young leaders got their chance. Rob Muldoon, who'd controlled the economy and commanded the nation for 9 years, called a snap election.
So we've got a date, Prime Minister?
We got a date, the 14th of July, which we've worked out at Government House as being the appropriate date.
That doesn't give you much time to run up to an election, Prime Minister.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
His opponent for Prime Minister was lawyer David Lange, Labour Party leader for only 12 months.
And I'd like to compliment you, Sheila Prentice, been in the party now for over 50 years, and I'd like to present you with this gold badge.
Oh,
thank you.
Well, I'd like to say before we leave that anything I've done for the Labour Party over the 50 years or more, I've never regretted and I've never lost faith, and don't any of you lose faith.
All right. The most important issue the new Labour government will have to face is the approach required to achieve Labour's goals of employment, economic growth and social justice, and those issues are totally intertwined.
I got a little grandson who's just on 3, and he can read his own name, and that's about as far as Mr. Lange can go economically. Economically. Oh, he's much better than that in some other things. He's a great talker. Oh, my goodness. He's a great talker. But he's an economic illiterate. And that's dangerous for anyone that wants to head a government.
Behind me we have a Prime Minister.
I want us to go from here tonight, working for New Zealand, rejoicing that we have had this victory, and then setting ourselves to work together.
Roger Douglas, you're the person that I guess most people are now picking to take over the finance portfolio. What do you think you're going to be able to do for the country in the economic field?
Well, I think that New Zealand has tremendous potential. It has to be remembered that in 1956 we were the richest country in the world. We've slipped down. We can get back there, I believe.
New Minister of Finance Roger Douglas wanted to try new ways to get back to prosperity. Encouraged and supported by advisors from Treasury and the Reserve Bank, traditional hands-on economic management was abandoned. Instead, business models and market theories would transform the economy.
Finance ministries all over the world tend to be economically liberal in the way they think, and the New Zealand Finance Ministry was no exception, so that it was a harmony of thought about those issues when he came in.
The minister and his advisors knew their new approach meant the commitment to full employment would have to be abandoned.
You cannot just resist indefinitely the tides of change and the forces of the market.
Well, this really was a period of evangelism, of people driven by ideology and philosophy that was totally abstracted from the real world, that people and society were driven by self-interest, that society was made up of individuals interacting in the marketplace. Those who succeeded deserved the rewards. Those who failed were either responsible as individuals or because the nanny state was preventing them from reaching their full potential and from the markets adjusting to the forces that were driving them.
Treasury got to work, turning departments into businesses and pushing ministries into the marketplace. Government's main job now was to protect property rights and keep prices down. In other words, to get rid of inflation.
Inflation erodes the value of money. People with money want to have the property rights in their money guaranteed. So price stability is essentially a policy for the wealthy. But they also argue that inflation blurs the price signals that should guide money and people to the most efficient businesses and jobs. So if you have inflation, it blurs those signals. You need to get rid of inflation to have your most efficient market economy.
I would see that stable prices is a part of your regime of entrenching property rights, because you can ascribe property rights, but if the value of that property is unstable, the rights themselves are unstable. So price stability has to be seen as the part of a policy agenda that is directed at defining and entrenching property rights and an exchange mechanism of those rights. That's what we call a market.
Inflation is the number one problem that New Zealand has faced for the last 10 years, and that's what we're trying to solve.
They did it at any cost. It didn't matter about economic growth, it didn't matter about employment opportunities, it didn't matter about the social infrastructure much. You had to get inflation under control, and once you got that under control, then all these other things would happen.
The Reserve Bank was given the job of controlling inflation and maintaining price stability. Effectively in charge was Deputy Governor Rod Dean.
And I think the really important feature now that we are into this adjustment phase is that we maintain a consistent policy, and that's indeed what the government is doing. We have to allow for lags. There are lags in the process, and in time the policy will work as it's meant to work.
Roger Douglas, behind his thinking was the idea if we had stable inflation, there would resource use and investment would not be as much in housing, but would be more in the areas, export-related areas and so on, that would bring us more economic growth. Unfortunately, what he didn't recognise was the mechanism that would be used then by the Reserve Bank to manage inflation, which kept interest rates high.
Because interest rates were so high, business loans and home mortgages were more expensive. So were credit cards and hire purchases. People had less money to invest, less to spend, less to live on.
Good morning, Paul speaking.
We were paying $500 a month. We're now paying over $900 a month.
That's a lot of dough.
I actually sell real estate, and I've got people spending over 60% of their income in mortgages.
Private demand will ease because activity in the economy is easing for a number of reasons, particularly because people aren't spending so much because their disposable incomes have been pinned back over the past 6 months or so.
As spending fell, factories cut production. After a few months, they were sacking some workers.
The rumours have been going around for 3 months, and the management have always kept on saying that there wouldn't be any redundancies, and that if things would come right, but now they haven't, and it's frightening for them.
Something's got to be done about inflation, but I don't know what. I don't think what's being done at the moment is a hell of a good.
And for you personally, what does this mean? What are you going to do now?
Live off Mr. Longy for a while.
Well, the theory is that when unemployment is low, there are always skill shortages, and workers have the ability to demand higher wages and to secure higher wages because the employers are competing amongst each other for scarce labour, and that pushes up costs, and employers then recover those costs in terms of higher prices. And so unemployment is quite a vicious but effective way of dampening wage pressure and of, therefore, controlling prices.
It was a manageable thing for the Reserve Bank to initially use employment and unemployment as the way to get wages down. It was far easier than any other means of getting inflation down. So they used it.
It is important that you recognise the historical significance of the particular wage struggle that we're into today. It's important in the fact that your union is considered to be a responsible union, a union that believes in negotiation as the best method of resolving disputes, and is faced with a very real crisis at the present time in not only trying to renew your award, but in trying to defend and protect your standard of living and the very real conditions that you presently have in the workshops in Dunedin.
In wage negotiations, rising unemployment strengthened the hand of employers and helped them to keep wages and production costs down. Prices and inflation eased.
What we have at the moment is a situation where we're right on track to have inflation down to single-digit figures by this time next year, by March of next year. We will have under 4% 3 or 4 years out.
Because I want to tell you that we couldn't carry on with the solutions of the 30s to the challenges of the 80s. I want to tell you that this government is as firmly wedded to the social priorities of Labor governments as any government ever has been, and further, because we have been economically realistic, we have been able to deliver more in social terms than other governments have been able to do in the first 22 months.
But many workers and rank-and-file Labour Party members were not persuaded. Angry and worried, they brought their concerns to party conferences.
Who wants some job protection?
Now what I hear in my union, and I come from a delegates meeting just a couple of days ago, is deep anger, and I want to bring that here to you. That's what those people are saying. They see the poor getting poorer and the rich celebrating. They watch these Barclays indexes go up and the joy of the stock exchange. That's the echoes that are in my ear when I come here.
There are less full-time jobs in New Zealand now than there were 12 months ago. Registered unemployment is up 15,000 in the last 12 months, 5,000 in the last month. And registered unemployment is rising quickly in Christchurch, and no amount of rhetoric will alter those facts, delegates. I didn't intend to raise those matters, but the Minister has. And if we're going to talk truth in this conference, let's talk it.
And I think if you really put aside your desperate urge to support the government that you believe in
and the party that you belong to, you will acknowledge that there is something very wrong in New Zealand, and it is not getting better, it is getting worse.
The big guns came out, the triple whip was laid down, any deviation is a lack of confidence, and really they did almost demand that the party fallen behind.
There are some people who are totally opposed to the government's economic policy and who advocate what I call the Pol Pot approach. Destroy the lot so the socialist phoenix can rise from the ashes. We have struggled far too long to be fooled by this rhetorical dream. We have well learnt the lessons of our history, that it is only through unity we can work for the principles and policies in which we believe.
We had 16 votes out of a caucus of, 54, 55 to begin with, but there was a very strong theme running, you've got to give the government a chance, and you can't oppose it because it's not fair. So the 16 dwindled to 12, 10, 8, 6, and then there was one. It was like 10 green bottles, really. And even close colleagues like Helen Clark decided the game wasn't worth the candle.
For half a century, public organisations like the railways and the post office, the forest service and even hospitals had been used to provide subsidised jobs when full employment was threatened. But now that the overriding commitment to full employment had been abandoned, the government felt free to direct public service managers to treat workers and wages as costs, to be cut where necessary to increase commercial efficiency and profits.
Railways is now a dynamic transport organisation, and that means that it adjusts to what the market wants, and that means in some areas we're expanding, like the coal wagons. In other areas we will contract, and that's how it ought to be. It should never be the idea that railways ought to be fixed and never change is just, it's not a proper way to run a business.
Just before the election, Mr. Prebble came through and met with the staff and made a lot of promises. One, that he would retain the workshops, and that under Labour we'd have a secure future, and that if we voted National we'd have no future at all, the shop would close. And this place has been running down ever since Labour's been in, and it looks like it's likely to close, or if not, be a very small shop.
E pai ana hau. Ko nui no atu te rua te ko mawalu tau oku I te reri, wai gari ko ngā mea ke I tia huri au. Ngā mea utu mōkiti ana, ne, ko mate ko rātou, ko taka rātou te ringa wai tua. E ngā mahi a te reri wa te corporation.
Well, in one sense, the cutbacks will never finish. We will always be looking to do the job better. But the sort of restructuring that we're going through at the moment will be completed in about 2 years' time.
In the 2 years after the 1984 election, 2,000 railway workers lost their jobs. Across all government departments, jobs went at an even faster rate. The public service was cut in half.
It's the greatest real estate investment, truly, I've ever been part of. It's 16 acres. It was owned by the New Zealand Railways, and they used it as their East Town workshops. So what I've done, I've leased out all the individual buildings. You know, the place that used to be the car and wagon repair shop is now a panel bedding shop, and where they used to paint all their wagons, that's now a spray painting booth. And we've got work skills programs, you know, these new access programs. Yeah. We've got the New Zealand Railways, they came and leased some of it. Oh, that was exciting.
Leased it back off you?
Yeah, leased it back. I thought that was a good deal.
Have you managed to lease all of East Town?
No, nearly. I've got 3 buildings left to go. I should have those leased by, say, next week, end of next week.
But within 2 years, Clayton Crow's property business was bankrupt. The closure of the East Town workshops pushed Wanganui unemployment to 8% of the workforce. Figures like that deeply disturbed the trade unions. They called on their members to show what they thought of what was now called Rogernomics.
This mindless purism, this market madness, it is tearing our country apart. It is ideology gone mad. It is putting the pain on those who can least afford it.
Most workers were union members, and the government, especially a Labour government, couldn't ignore the unions or their national conference.
While we have reservations about aspects of unions, we have a commitment to the industrial movement which our opponents never will have. while you have reservations about us in government, we are not going to sway you as a matter of principle. And on the basis of that ease of relationship and understanding, together we can produce some pretty worthwhile results for New Zealand.
Within the union movement, there was such a feeling that, well, look, don't let's bugger it up again. Don't let's have just a one-term government. Give the government a go. And even in the period where the Federation of Labour leadership was really being very, very strongly critical of the government, our affiliates were saying, no, don't rock the boat, you've got to give them a go.
You have a government which talks and listens, doesn't always do what you want, but it talks and listens, and it is a government which is pro-union, not anti-union.
Previously, the Federation of Labour's principal objective was to maintain real wage values for workers. In 1987, we said that's no longer a sustainable proposition when you've got high levels of unemployment. The priority for the union movement must be a political and industrial program about jobs. We've got to sharply address, bluntly, industrially if necessary, the whole question of the government's policy about job creation and unemployment. And I think whilst the unions voted for that with their hands, they didn't vote with it with their minds because not much behaviour changed.
Ever since World War II, governments had helped farmers get through difficult years with price stabilisation schemes and subsidies to keep up farm production and incomes. A stable rural economy was seen as essential to maintaining full employment. But farmers were hurting under the new policies and the Reserve Bank's money controls.
If interest rates don't come down and prices don't go up for our stock, we will be in big trouble and we mightn't be here in 12 months' time.
We had a married couple here. He left and we decided we'd try and get by with a single boy. And he was here for about 9 months. And then we decided that he would have to go. I've cut my fertiliser. I'm putting no lime on. We've got a gorse problem on this place. That's just growing. I can't afford to buy a lot of chemical or pay $14, $15, $20 an hour for someone to spray it. We're going to have farmers walking off the land. We're going to have the effects of that on employment, of the downspending on employment. And if we relate the employment figures, that we have one job on the farm relates to 4 off the farm, it's going to have a very marked effect on employment throughout New Zealand.
Thousands of farmers converged on the capital. It was the biggest out-of-town demonstration ever seen at Parliament. The main demand was for the government to abandon the Reserve Bank's policy of high interest rates to ease the pressure that was sending many farmers to the brink of bankruptcy.
No competent farmer will be forced off their land. And I repeat that will be the situation. And we will find ways and means of making sure that those people stay in farming.
Fearing a government backdown, the governor of the Reserve Bank stepped into the political arena.
I thought it would be a pity if, in the situation of the present downturn, this led to increased pressures on government to try and provide relief to certain sectors, because I think it is in everybody's interest, and if one's talking about the farming sector, for example, inflation is the major problem which has caused the farming sector's present difficulties, much more so than exchange rates, much more so than lower commodity prices, high interest rates, etc.
But that's a position, isn't it? I mean, not everyone would agree with you. You've taken a stand.
It is a judgment, and I think I'm entitled to make that judgment.
Can you think of a precedent, though, of a governor having gone as far?
I can't think of one at the moment, but I'm sure it has happened in the past.
But there would be many people in the community who thought there should be relief on exchange rates or interest rates. You've taken a position.
I've pointed out the danger that could arise if moves were made to relieve some of those pressures. Because to take pressure off interest rates would involve a loosening of monetary policy, and that in turn would delay us getting our inflation rate down to an acceptable level. And the whole livelihood of the nation depends upon doing just that.
There was no change. The anti-inflation policy continued. Interest rates stayed high. Stock numbers fell. Soon, giant freezing works like Whakatu near Hastings were closing. Provincial towns and cities were hit hard.
Certainly some retailers are finding it very, very hard. Others are doing reasonably well, but it has been a problem.
Why would they be finding it hard, though? Is the spending power decreased that much?
Certainly. Certainly when people aren't getting paid or haven't got jobs, they're not spending, and there has been a problem in that area.
Can we keep every freezing worker in a job throughout New Zealand as they were 2 years ago? The answer is that no government could.
So for the people of Whakatu, it's tough, but it's necessary. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, except remember, they're not just necessarily from Whakatu, they're from all different parts of the area, and sometimes from New Zealand, who migrate there, and there are alternative employment possibilities. But if you were on the payroll at Whakatu...
Where are the alternatives?
Well, I opened a medium-density fibre mill in the South Island last week. I've opened tomato processing plants. Every week, just about, I open a new industry. There are 10,000 new companies registered in New Zealand last year. That's no consolation if your last pay packet came from Whakatu. But, you know, we just can't keep having the same number of people processing 10 million fewer lambs a year.
What's going to happen in a year's time when the redundancy's been paid out? We've invested, like most of us have, but then come 12 months on, when the works doesn't open, seasonal work is not yet coming in. We're going to be at home worrying about where our next pay packet, where our next job is going to come from.
The strategy of allowing unemployment to increase conflicted with the traditional role of the Labour Department, which was to help maintain full employment. To do that, it used to set up work schemes for people for whom it couldn't find jobs.
The government policies were designed on providing temporary short-term work for people until such time as the economy improved and they could get back into normal work. They saw it as a short-term thing.
In past times of economic recession, especially in the late 70s and early 80s, work schemes had been an important tool in keeping people at work. But after 1984, such schemes undermined the Reserve Bank's policy, which was to increase the number of people actively looking for work. Treasury economist Charles Mackenzie was appointed to head the Labour Department.
We tried to make the employment centres more attractive. We got rid of all counters. We put employment officers up at the face with the computerised all the databases so that you could sit with a job seeker and go through the vacancies or go through their details of what they wanted and whether they'd made any changes. You give them advice. Set up job clubs, things like that.
And you were made redundant from Amalgamated of Batteries, like February.
Yes.
Yeah, looks like the last time too, you made redundant as well.
Last time.
Yeah.
There was another time there as well.
The direction changed to helping people to compete for available work. Not actually get the work, but to be able to compete for it.
This was in line with Reserve Bank policy. More unemployed people competing for jobs was bound to drive wages down. Subsidised work schemes were disbanded and replaced, for some, by training programs.
How much were you getting in PEP?
230 a week.
230. And how much on this?
136.
Would you prefer PEP to this generally?
Yes.
What are you going to do when it finishes, when this training finishes?
Oh, I don't know. Probably go back on the dollars.
What about you? When you finish the scheme here, what will you do?
Just travel around till I find a job, hopefully.
I mean, we don't like to sit back here and watch our children on the dole.
And I think someone's got to look into that. Not so much even start now, because when our kids are, 18, 19, what is there for them? Nothing. So I think someone better get their act together, because it's only going to get worse. Unemployment, that's going to be with us forever, isn't it? If no one's going to do anything about it.
Over the 3 years of the Labour government's free market economic policies, the share market had boomed. In 1987, another general election was approaching. Some traditional National voters shifted to Labour. Some traditional Labour voters felt betrayed.
Roger Douglas's policy of a trickle-down theory, where if you give big business their money, it trickles down. Well, it's a bit like a horse. They seem to be feeding the horse, but the trickle-down in regards to the farmers, the small farmers and the small businessmen and in particular workers, the trickle-down is the bit that comes out the bad end of the horse.
It will go to the people on a continuation of our program, which they are able to make a judgment on, because it's there. And then for the next 3 years, they're going to have to make a judgment as to how this government will make this country a more secure place for them to live in. There will undoubtedly be an increase in unemployment. That's perfectly plain. And then it will recover. There is now a unanimous view by those analysts of our economy that we will have single-digit inflation before the end of March next year. We are fundamentally on track.
The opposition National Party had a new leader, Jim Bolger.
Our policies put a clear option in front of New Zealanders. Unlike Labour, there are no hidden agendas, no secret deals, just straightforward, honest policies in line with our commitment to a fair society.
Can I say to you that I find it enormously fulfilling that for the first time since 1938, the Labour movement has been re-elected to a second term in New Zealand Parliament. Can I thank you?
A few weeks after the election, the New York stock market crashed. Share prices here tumbled, cutting the value of New Zealand companies by more than half.
Sell Chase $4. Sell Chase $4.
The Reserve Bank responded by lowering interest rates to encourage spending.
I think in present circumstances, a downward adjustment in interest rates is quite appropriate. I think that this wouldn't lead to any upsurge in the demand for credit, and we'd be quite comfortable at seeing interest rates come back.
Are you generally satisfied with the results today?
Yes, I think it's been a signal to the market that we're prepared to keep the system liquid and at the same time not depart from the overall stance of monetary policy, which remains with the objective of getting inflation down.
The Labour cabinet continued to be dominated by the free market ideas of its finance ministers.
I believe that the events of the last 3 weeks mean that we need to accelerate the process of reform rather than stop it.
If this regime continues, and we are now coming to the conclusion the government is going to ensure that it continues into the months ahead, then that will simply mean massive closures and spiralling by this stage and going into a tailspin.
So how safe are the jobs of the 9,000 employees that you currently look after?
Unfortunately, for a goodly number of them, where we're in these sensitive areas, those jobs can't be said to have any real sense of guarantee at all.
And how do you feel about that as an employer?
I feel terrible.
So why don't you get on a plane and go down to Wellington and tell them how you feel about it?
Anna, I tried that a couple of times, and I found that I was just wasting my breath. Worst of all, I was being patronised, and swore to myself that so long as that environment existed, I would write about it, but I was no longer going to kick any doors down and be patronised anymore.
In October 1988, unemployed workers set out on protest marches, beginning in Te Hapua in the far north and in Invercargill in the south.
What do we mean? All our children. What do we mean?
Unemployed people do have answers, do have solutions to unemployment. We've always had them. We've always known that there's another way than what the government's doing to us. But the fundamental to the whole thing, though, is our demand of jobs, that every one of us has a right to a job, and we think that the whole economic and political thrust of society should be focused on that rather than on abstract political principles such as lowering inflation, that the key thing is full employment and that it's a human right to work, because work isn't just earning money, it's being part of a whole social context and having a meaningful position in life.
My name is John Wilson. I'm from Rotorua. I've been on the march from Te Hapua to Port Neke, Wellington, from the start. The issues that we are raising is that it's a march against unemployment and also a march against injustice. Bosses, big business is saying to the workers, if you don't watch your step, we'll kick your ass out of here. There's 160,000 unemployed out there waiting to take your job. You've been used as a weapon against the workers.
Years ago, when these people actually established themselves in the community, got jobs out here on the site, being the major employer in the Tokoroa region, they seen themselves as having a bright future, and they set themselves up with homes, etc., built families, and all their incomes went into providing an ongoing facility for their family. Now we're at a stage where Tokoroa is being depleted. People are trying to leave town, but they can't sell their homes because they're not worth anything. They need money to be able to set themselves up in another centre. It costs 3 times as much as what it does to buy a house in Tokoroa as what it does to buy one in Hamilton. And yet it's only a distance of 3/4 of an hour away. The blimmin' rundown of their finances, their life savings, if you like, what they've put into their home, what they've put into the bank, etc., would all be taken up. They're actually trapped here, and you're trapped in a community of unemployment.
The situation in the South Island. We speak to the communities that are suffering, that are being devastated. Their services are being closed down in the South Island.
Got here on Kaunaraha, I think. The strength of the communities and the love of the people as we're moving through them is just incredible. The unions, the maraes, the voluntary community organisations, everywhere that we've stayed, it's just been incredible. People coming to us, turning on the food, the accommodation, telling us what's happening in their area, giving us messages to bring through, which we've got, which we'll be presenting.
There's not only people from Pōneke here, but also from many towns and cities all over New Zealand. Statistics are 150,000 out of work. By the end of the year, the true figure will be well over 200,000. What Mr Goff and his friends up here do not realise is that we're not just statistics, something that the Labour Department puts out each month. We're actually human beings. We've given the Minister and a number of these other politicians here a series of key demands. For many of us is for full employment. We demand, as a human right, the right to work.
I am here today with Mike Cullen
and others of my colleagues, because we are taking your march seriously. We have agreed to accept from you the list of demands that you have taken. We have agreed to read those seriously.
Bullshit! Bullshit!
If you want real jobs, not jobs based on subsidies, not jobs that are artificial, then you need an economy that performs. An economy that performs is necessary to provide those real jobs. It's necessary if you are to get better living standards. It's necessary if you are to generate the wealth that you need for a decent social system.
That evening, Phil Goff appeared on television.
Don't you gloss over the fact, though, that the government has used unemployment as a lever in its fight against inflation, and that's why the unemployed feel aggrieved. They are being used as a tool of economic policy.
I don't gloss over it. I reject that analysis entirely. I want to get back to a point that Sue made in that regard. It's not a case of saying inflation is more important than employment. The basis for job growth must be a stable, low inflation economy where the social partners and government work together. I think that is a good formula, and I believe that the thrust of government policy has been to deal with problems like inflation and to deal with problems like New Zealand's low productivity, which have been major barriers in terms of New Zealand being competitive in overseas markets and therefore able to sell more overseas and create more jobs to create that production.
Over the years of full employment, governments had imposed import controls and tariff barriers to protect manufacturers from cheap imports and protect the jobs of Kiwi workers. This usually meant higher prices and fewer choices for consumers, but bigger and more regular pay packets for workers. After 1984, that had to change. Protection for New Zealand products and jobs conflicted with Labour's new right economic theories.
We don't see the point of imposing high costs on everyone in order to advantage the few. If you want to reconcile this kind of these sets of decisions with what might be described as traditional Labour principles, I think that's it in a nutshell. That the historical high protection imposes costs on everyone for the benefit of a few, and I don't think that was either sensible economics or a fair approach to the use of the resources of the country.
Changes in the protection regime will also start putting downward pressure on prices because manufacturers will be facing increased competition from abroad.
As an economy, we had to get inflation down first, then everything else good would start to happen, and the temporary price paid by people out of jobs would be more than made up by the gains that would come out of it. So that was firmly believed, and the effect of lower tariffs on people losing their jobs was simply that if manufacturers couldn't find a way of manufacturing the product more cheaply so that it could be competitive with imported goods, then obviously it would have to lay off staff.
We want work! We want work! Save ourselves! We want work! We want work!
I can tell you this, my people are going down the track now. I've got to sit there and look at them. I've got to go in and handle that part. Well, I'll tell the Minister this, that if he likes to come along with me at the next big closure, he can come along and talk to those people and tell them how good New Zealand really is under his government. I'm sure they'll be delighted.
One day we were caught up into the smoker room and just told we had a week left to go.
First day, he came over 3:30 and told us, and with the pay, with our check, you know.
So he gave you your pay packets and said you're leaving today?
Yeah. And that's it, they're finished.
Well, did you ask about redundancy or did the union?
Yes, we asked for the redundancy, but he said no. He got no redundancy.
The job vacancy scene is very tight. It's very difficult to get into work now. The number of vacancies that are being notified has decreased by 1/3 over the last 3 years. The competition for the jobs that exist is very stiff. The number of people who are coming through the door now has increased, and in fact we've had about 3,000 people made redundant since January of this year in the South Auckland region.
They're mostly people with dependents, and this really worries me because the figures themselves tell only part of the story. You know, behind every unemployed person there could be 3 or 4 other people who are suffering equally.
Toey, who do you blame for what went wrong at the factory?
I blame the government.
Why the government?
Well, they're the one who know that's why this thing happened, redundancy, because they import cheap stuff from overseas, so the company can't sell their one.
As unemployment rose, so wage demands were forced down.
The cost of living adjustments that people now sort of look back on with some nostalgia were part of the cost plus days. Now, we're not in that environment anymore. And this year, straight wage increases or excessive wage demands will simply result, if they are granted, in company closures and further unemployment.
In the 1988 wage round, employers were in a strong position. Union negotiators were on the back foot.
If we were sitting down discussing or arguing points across the table, it became very difficult for us because they were citing their costs. And you always had this threat, well, if we don't do this, the business is gone and there's more unemployment. And so we always had that argument, and it was very hard to get around because you couldn't argue against the fact that unemployment had risen.
We've never been interested in the 7%. We believe that's far too high, completely unacceptable. But we are willing to make some offer if there is something by way of compensation.
And if there's no agreement from the unions in terms of the counterclaims?
Well, it's improbable there will be an employer's wage offer.
But they're asking us to take a punt on what might be their wage offer, and the union negotiators are in no mood for arguments about real wage cuts. Please take a guess on what we might do. Let's batten down the hatches, and in some way New Zealand industry will survive. That's just not going to be sufficient.
Those are the plain, straight up and down facts. Push companies into that situation, pass what they can afford, and you are pushing some of their workers out on the streets. In today's climate, that, in my view, is a crime.
By now, the Reserve Bank had a new, younger and more assertive governor, Don Brash.
Wage rises of the magnitude experienced over the past 3 years are simply incompatible with the stance of monetary policy, and so lead directly to company collapses and unemployment.
Unemployment is a social tragedy of enormous dimensions in New Zealand, and if we're going to get it down, this wage round has to be settled at a low level and preferably below inflation.
The unions organised rallies and marches, but their protest was muted. Not since the 1930s had workers so feared losing their jobs.
They would then say, we're going to do something, but they also were saying at the same time that we've got to be careful what we do because otherwise we won't have a job. So they were sort of stuck in their argument. And some jobs did take some action, but a lot of places where the people were pretty feared. It was starting to get to the situation where everybody knew somebody who had lost a job, somebody in their family had lost a job.
In 1988, the unions were forced to accept wage settlements 2.5% below the inflation rate. In 1989, it was 3% below.
I believe inflation is substantially beaten at this stage, and I think the inflation rate will continue moving down. I would be aiming at a very low rate of inflation. In fact, it's been suggested, I think, I'm not sure whether facetiously or not, that if inflation isn't minimised or indeed eliminated from the New Zealand system, the Governor of the Central Bank should perhaps be looking for another job.
How do you feel about this reaction to your policies?
Oh, Brenda Moulton.
You don't think that this general
A wimp. Well, I don't particularly feel like that, but don't care for that much.
You don't feel it's a reaction to your policies in selling off state-owned enterprises?
No, I think it's partly a reaction to the level of unemployment, and in that sense it's understandable.
How do you think you could...
I had an electorate committee, I think, of something like 20, and they were very solid citizens, you know, heartland workers who would never have missed a day at work in their life, you know, the good day's work for a good day's pay kind of people. By the time we got to 88, 14 out of the 20 were unemployed. Several of them had been unemployed 3 times. And I was coming back from Wellington to LEC meetings, fronting these people who'd worked hard for me and the Labor Party. And what was I going to say to them? What could I say to them?
Public opinion polls showed support for Labour plummeting. The party organisation seemed to be tearing itself apart. Reserve Bank officials prepared legislation to insulate the bank and its policies from political pressure.
The new legislation was designed not only to make it difficult to change, but to quarantine it from political interference when the policy went wrong, when it started to have adverse effects both on people's lives, the real economy, jobs, but also when governments politically came under pressure to change it. So we have the sense that this policy is in the national interest, the governor of the bank is the guardian of the national interest, and anyone who seeks to change it is in some way a traitor to the interests of the country.
The Minister's introduction to Parliament of the Reserve Bank Act was, of course, supported by the bank's governor.
The Minister of Finance is recognising that the countries which have been most successful in getting inflation under control have been those with central banks which are somewhat independent of direct political influence.
Do you think that a central bank can ever be free of political influence?
Well, I guess not totally free, but there are degrees of freedom, and I think what's envisaged, as I read what's in the budget tonight, will be quite significantly more free than has been the true in the past.
The contract signed by the government and the governor required the Reserve Bank to bring inflation below 2% per annum.
The days of the Minister of Finance being able to pick up the telephone and soften monetary policy are gone.
Once the targets have been set, it was felt that it was then more of a technical matter to achieve the targets in the best way that the Reserve Bank could see that those targets could be achieved. Rather than getting daily political interference of the type that we had prior to the mid-1980s, which almost inevitably led to very short-term decisions being taken that almost invariably caused long-term problems.
Now, the governor could not be touched by the democratic process. He was even beyond the influence of his own bank's board of directors.
When we asked for more information about how the bank managed monetary policy, we would get some special lectures, but we weren't given the role of actual, contribution to the models and so on that were used by the bank to look at employment and its impact. So, in a sense, we're kind of helpless to say, well, is there another way to do it? You're telling us that this is essential, that this rise in unemployment and capping of wage growth is essential for us to get price stability so that we have long-term growth in the economy. But could you have an alternative path? In fact, several times I suggested that they really needed to set their model up so that it could test a number of different cases. There must have been more than one path to do things. And I was told it would be too expensive for the bank to invest in a model that looked at different adjustment paths. They wouldn't want to charge the taxpayer extra money for such a model.
The imperative right now is to eliminate inflation completely. We're making very good progress on that, but inflationary expectations are still much higher than the actual level of inflation, and we have to eliminate that inflation, eliminate it quickly.
Tight money policies, therefore, will continue under your regime.
I'm very much in favour of eliminating inflation as the most important single thing to do at the moment.
Unemployment continued to rise, but the trade unions were using every legal tactic they could to keep wages up. Reserve Bank theory said inflation would fall if wages could be pushed down more rapidly. Bank officials urged the government to liberalise labour laws, abolish the minimum wage and break down trade union powers to defend wages and conditions. The Business Roundtable, a lobby group of local and multinational chief executives, also wanted to see union powers cut.
I think deregulation is perhaps not the wrong word, but certainly a total change and a simplification in the present rules of the labour market. The compulsory unionism, the fixed awards that we have, the inability of people to group themselves in their own sort of unions for their own business, and in particular we would like to see enterprise unions established, and we're not anti-union. We are wanting to open up an economy that will employ more people.
The Business Roundtable saw eye to eye with the finance ministers, but had less and less success influencing the Prime Minister.
I like jousting with the Knights of the Round Table. It's been a good 40 minutes.
And they understand your position?
They understand my position.
Eventually, David Lange was unable to control the momentum of the new right.
There is no place in New Zealand for deregulated labour markets. There is no place in New Zealand for doing away with the minimum wage. I have confirmed with the Governor-General my intention tomorrow to be present at Government House in the afternoon to tender to him my resignation as Prime Minister.
Confused and divided, the Labour government would change leaders yet again before the 1990 election. Sure that there would be a new government after the election, the Employers Association instructed lawyer Paul Bell to plan legislation which would remove trade union protection from tens of thousands of workers. Bell's draft legislation was given to the opposition National Party.
This is a formula for all seasons. It's a formula for both economic and social progress, and we're confident people will back it.
Checkbooks are always open for political parties, so long as they get the things right.
During the election campaign, National promised to halve unemployment within 3 years.
Our program is for real growth, more jobs and higher pay.
Many traditional Labour supporters stayed at home. National won in a landslide and was to govern for the next 9 years.
From tonight, the politics of inclusion begins. I want to include everybody in the great challenge we face. We must face it together.
Thanks.
Welcome to Treasury.
Thank you very much.
Can I introduce you to some of my colleagues?
Now, the big four monetary forces, politicians, Treasury, business and Reserve Bank, were all aligned. All supported the theory that if there were no unions and workers simply competed against each other for jobs, inflation could be easily controlled.
I recall Ken Douglas and I going to see Graham Scott, who was Secretary to the Treasury just after the change of government in 1990, because Treasury had been very positive in terms of the need for labour market deregulation. And we said, well, how do you form this view? I mean, you don't come to the market, you don't meet the traders. How do you give policy advice on what should happen in the labour market? And his response was, theory tells us the answer. And theory said labour markets have to be highly centralised or highly decentralised. It's not realistic to expect high levels of centralisation, and so high levels of decentralisation is all that's left.
The extremism of their thinking and these flights of fantasy that they sort of engaged in about this place where all this sort of free movement of things happened. It was just so unrealistic to the reality of New Zealand life that I found it difficult to take him seriously.
6 weeks after the election, the new government prepared to pass the Employment Contracts Act.
It is policy which is developed to suit the situation in New Zealand, and it is the result of several years' work.
I believe the real reason behind this legislation is to get at the wages of the low-income workers. That's the real reason.
Despite protests, the Employment Contracts Act became law. Over the next few years, union membership would drop by tens of thousands.
The effects on wage levels tended to happen when people changed jobs. Okay, so they didn't come in and say, you're earning $10, you're now getting $8. What tended to happen when someone was earning $10 and they left the job, the next person who was employed on 8. So they used turnover to change wage levels. And the other thing that I think happened was not so much wages, but conditions of employment. So instead of people having reasonable security of employment and reasonable predictability of employment, they were hired on a as-needs basis. So if you're on the books of a restaurant, come in on Monday and Tuesday, we'll give you a call if there's anybody in the restaurant on Thursday. And so people had very unreliable hours, unreliable earnings, short-term contract-type employment.
Next, attention turned to welfare benefits for the unemployed. They were too high, it was claimed, and were undermining the Reserve Bank's strategy to get wages down.
The real criterion for assistance was need, and it didn't matter how the need occurred. If a person was in need, they ought to be helped. And they ought to be helped to the level in which they could participate and belong in New Zealand society and eat the same sort of food as other New Zealanders eat, play the sort of games, wear the same sort of clothes, partake in a modest way in the same sort of entertainment and social life. That had been the single focus for the system.
Free market theory said that when there wasn't much difference between a low wage and the dole, beneficiaries had less and less incentive to look for work. The Reserve Bank wanted the unemployment benefit lowered. But how far? Treasury's Social Policy Branch tried to determine what American economists call a minimum income standard. In other words, a poverty line.
I have responsibility for family assistance and sole parents, and have also been looking at work on adequacy, how you define what an adequate income is.
Treasury economists Marianne Ainsley and Edith Brashares based their calculations on home budgeting plans developed by Dunedin researchers.
We have very good dietary guidelines, and we are aware of the quantities people need to ingest all the nutrients that they need. We make up a sensible amount of food that a man, a woman, children of different ages will eat in 1 week.
Those researchers had come up with 4 food budgets: liberal, moderate, basic, and low.
The low end is that some people wish to be very careful about how much they spend on food. Some people have excellent skills, they can cook well, they say, I'm quite happy to take low-cost meats, cook them long and slow, spend time preparing everything from scratch.
For their Treasury calculations, Ainsley and Brashares took the lowest budget food plan as their baseline.
This illustrates the income gap, 7 different poverty lines we drew. As you can see, the food time...
But they didn't tell the Dunedin researchers what they were going to do with the budget food plan.
I looked at what people in the households I'd studied actually spent on food. If it was down in the low range, those people could not and did not sustain good nutrition. So it seemed to me it was not a good thing to put out a low range, because while originally we felt there were people who had the skills to eat well on that, current observation was saying that people did not have the ability and skills to eat well if they only spent what we considered a low budget amount.
Ainsley and Brashares took the low budget and reduced it by 20%.
No, it's just...
At that level, they calculated what Treasury called the New Zealand Income Adequacy Standard.
Which are consistent with it.
Treasury officials used the standard as the basis for new welfare payments.
By the end of this day, Mr. Speaker, the new government will have moved to harmonise monetary, fiscal and labour market policies in a manner that will lay strong foundations for sustained growth and substantial reduction in unemployment. Thank you.
All welfare benefits were to be cut, with the biggest reductions for people on the unemployment benefit.
Suddenly, just a few days before Christmas, less than a week before Christmas, we were there in the office on the Wednesday afternoon, I think it was, and my manager came in and said, look, he said, they've made an announcement in Parliament, and here it is. And it was quite short, just 2 or 3 pages, but it completely overtook anything that we might be planning to do. Just in these few pages, it had completely changed the whole way in which the welfare system had been developing over the last, well, best part of 50 years.
There is some work out there that people currently decline because they say that they are better off on a benefit. One of the major reasons why this government has had to face up to doing the things that we announced is that we need to create the gap between work and welfare.
Dr. Branch, are the savings announced today sufficient to take the pressure off monetary policy?
It's quite clear that the changes announced have been substantial, and we've issued a press statement today already. In fact, I think it's issued roughly contemporaneously, indicating that we believe the changes have been very constructive in terms of taking the pressure off monetary policy.
The unemployment benefit for single adults was cut by a quarter.
Hi, I was just wondering if there's any job vacancies available.
No, nothing at all. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.
Right.
I go down to warehouses and factories all through Penrose, Otahu, Onehunga, Avondale, which I've been through and got nothing.
You say you've been around here. You've been along Rosebank Road?
Yes, I've been to just about every factory down here and every shop. I've been over here, all the way down here to these shops down here, through Sontana, Cadbury, right through there.
Will the benefit cuts make you try harder to get work, do you think?
I can't try any harder.
In Kaitaia, on the day benefit cuts came in, unemployment had already reached 15%.
Things like what had been set aside for rates and power and that, which was before this actual cut come in, it's all had to be altered now.
If you pay your bills, you can't do any grocery shopping. And we end up with $36 a week for our food shopping. And you can't do it with $36.
Right, so you've really felt the cuts have affected you quite badly, have they?
Yeah, they've come in about.
Soon, thousands of families were relying on charity for their food.
From this time last year, it's tripled, and it went up, doubled the number in a month after the benefit cuts came in. And it's going up. And it's different people coming in. This is an interesting thing. I don't know whether you're getting different ones.
Yes, we are.
Yeah. But the people are coming in are new people. They're not ones that have been coming all the time.
And you find they're really embarrassed too.
They are. They hate it. Yes,
They stand there sort of twisting their handbags, don't they? Putting their heads down.
Okay. See you later.
Hi. Hi, I'm Raymond from the Budget Service.
Oh, hi.
How have things been going in the last week?
Oh, not too good. Not too good at all.
Right, how was your food budget last week?
Poor.
I'm not confident that many of the people I deal with are able to have their needs met.
But they're surviving.
They are surviving in their terms. They are maybe not eating properly. They're maybe not able to clothe their children properly. What are you managing to put away at the moment?
I've got about $50 at the moment, just over 50, about $52.
Right.
To last for the next about week, 10 days. My 7-year-old son, he's an asthmatic and he's supposed to have a second inhaler, and which the doctor gave me a prescription for a couple of weeks ago, but I haven't got that filled yet.
Right.
When I was asked the first time if I wanted a food parcel, I can remember my nose kind of going up in the air and thinking, I don't need a food parcel. Then I thought, come on, kid, be honest with yourself. You know, I didn't have anything there to feed the children, and you know, I just felt so ashamed that I couldn't do that. You know, I'm their mother, and I've always taken that responsibility very highly. And you know, I love them and care for them very much, and having to choose whether to pay like to keep the power on, or whether to feed the children. Those sort of decisions are just inhumane.
Poorer communities were severely affected.
Things get quieter, we'll just have to wind down our production and just go as we take every week as it goes.
If the retailers aren't getting the money, then they're not buying a lot of the products themselves throughout the community.
In one city alone, Lower Hutt, $411,000 a week was taken away from beneficiaries. Shops closed. Services disappeared. In the first 8 months after the benefit cuts, 36,000 full-time jobs were lost.
How do you spend your days now?
Looking for work, that's all about it. Smoking cigarettes and sitting around doing nothing.
Is it pretty boring?
Yeah, fantastically boring.
Unemployment rose to over 11%.
Again, the Reserve Bank wouldn't have been disturbed by this because they were seeing unemployment as a way of getting more of a more active wage market, and so that they would be able to get wage rates down, because the fear of unemployment would lead to people not demanding such high wage rates. Well, they were right about all that.
Wages fell, price rises slowed, inflation dropped to 1%.
Figures are all very well for politicians and the business roundtable and people in that sort of strata of society. For us down at the coalface, particularly the unemployed, i.e. me, it doesn't mean a damn. It's a job we want.
The policymakers congratulated themselves on their success between 1984 and 1991, what they called the period of disinflation. The Reserve Bank allowed interest rates to fall and the economy to begin to recover.
A battle's been won, the war's not been won. I guess the war is won when New Zealanders generally accept that inflation is down on a permanent basis.
Lower interest rates made it easier to borrow and spend.
We have seen an upturn in business, mainly in credit card sales, and that's sort of an indication that people are starting to feel a little bit better about money.
We've been doing dairy conversions for the last 12 months, and we're nowhere near finished yet. So it's employed another 4 or 5 men for just that alone.
Oh, I think things are starting to move for New Zealand, and hopefully it'll keep improving.
Oh yeah, the recovery is happening. We'll be getting a bit more export work as we've got here, and it just seems to be more happening around, especially in Christchurch.
There's more people getting around the township now than compared to 2 or 3 years ago.
There's a real feeling of optimism around, and it's really neat.
Last year we created, for all the jobs lost, we created many more, 19,000 more. This year we'll create 30,000 more. So there's a dynamic. You will always have some firms who don't make it and some firms who start to flower. And increasingly we're on the winning side of that equation. We are employing more New Zealanders.
From 1991 to 1994, unemployment dropped from 11.1% to 7.4%.
There are now 64,000 more people employed than there were 1 year ago. This is the largest annual increase since the series began. Mr. Speaker, the news is all good.
But Reserve Bank officials feared more jobs would lead to higher wages and the return of inflation.
Commodity prices are rising strongly, profit margins are rising, wages are beginning to rise more strongly, inflation expectations
Not significantly.
rising.
Wages aren't rising
Well,
significantly.
if you take the year to September 93, private sector wages rose only about 0.5%. In the following year, September 94 year, they rose at nearly 3%, 2.7. So there's quite a strong pickup, and all the anecdotal evidence suggests that skilled labour, and indeed other kinds of semi-skilled and even unskilled labour, are increasingly becoming very hard to get hold of.
Once again, the Reserve Bank raised interest rates.
What we've been doing is trying very hard indeed to ensure inflation does not get re-established in New Zealand.
Employment's growing very, very strongly, certainly by New Zealand's historical standards. And what I think is trying to be achieved by this increase in interest rates is just to ensure that things don't get out of control.
We're predicting about a 1 percentage point increase in unemployment, back up to around 7%. And firms coming under cash flow pressures, and we've had a couple of firms be put into receivership, and capital spending falling.
The higher interest rates were soon attracting foreign investors and speculators and pushing up the value of the New Zealand dollar.
And 20 offer. On it up.
The movement in exchange rate that's taken place because of the Reserve Bank's push to maintain the inflation rate has increased the exchange rate very dramatically against us, and we're losing our competitive position in regard to that.
What impacts it having on your profitability?
Well, we can't increase our selling prices because we're in a very competitive market, and so we have to absorb any movement in the exchange rate by just reducing our margins and lowering our profitability.
The Reserve Bank has always denied that it had an operating unemployment target. But whenever unemployment got close to 6%, the Reserve Bank used to get very, very nervous and used to start putting the foot on the brake. So I would suspect that even if it's not formal and stuck up on a notice board, lurking in the back of the minds of the Reserve Bank policymakers is this notion that below 6% labour shortages emerge, wages pressures intensify.
The Reserve Bank thinks that if you let unemployment drop, the workers will get bolshy and start demanding higher wages. They may be right about that, and they may be right that higher wages would lead, at least for a while, to higher prices. The question is what happens after that. The Reserve Bank is worried that once you let inflation get away, it'll keep getting away. Other people think, no, that if you get unemployment down, those workers will become more productive, they'll make things, and in fact, in the long run, you can have lower unemployment without runaway inflation.
From now on, the Reserve Bank would manipulate interest rates so that at any given time, 100 to 150,000 Kiwis would be unemployed.
Keep coming and looking on the boards as well. You're welcome.
In June 1996, Don Brash went to London to give a speech in honour of Friedrich Hayek, a right-wing philosopher-economist. In his speech, Brash called for privatisation of all state-owned assets, criticised the Employment Contracts Act as not going far enough, and advocated more privatisation of health, education and social services, all, he said, progress towards the dream of a truly free society.
I'm giving a series of briefings to institutional investors here in Europe. I do it each year. They have an interest in what's going on in New Zealand, and I talk about that.
Why do you think there is such an interest in the New Zealand economy?
Oh, I don't think that's difficult to answer. I think there's been quite intense interest in the reform process over the last decade, and some of that's reflected in strong interest in offshore government circles and indeed offshore institutional circles to buy New Zealand government securities.
I mean, there seems to be a lot of admiration for what's happened in terms of the New Zealand economy. I mean, in your speech the other day, you said that it's important to carry on that work. Is that, do you think, how overseas investors would see it as well?
I don't want to comment on that. Thanks.
Our school's got 55%, either unemployed or in receipt of government benefits. And no matter how hard a family tries, that impinges greatly on the whole life of the kid, including their education.
Children that come to school hungry are often, more often than not, finding it very hard to settle. They have poor work habits, and more often than not, they're kept home because they have no food.
For the first time for a generation, schools were providing meals for their pupils.
These kids feel second rate. Why? Who's given them that message? They didn't get that message from the womb.
We have been told quite firmly by Mr. Bolger and one or two others that unemployment has got nothing whatsoever to do with crime. Unfortunately, they're the only people of all the researchers who've gone into it who happen to think so. These steel roller doors you see beside us, the council refused to have them because they gave the area such a bad name in the first place. Now you can't have any place without them. And the shops around this district, I don't think there'd be one now that would get insurance because they've been burgled and broken into and smashed up so often.
So what's happened, Josephine?
Somebody who's learned that I'm not home on a Thursday night just decided to take some things.
You've lost a lot?
Yeah. And it was all mine.
You don't make ends meet?
Probably have to stay with Mum or something. But I don't think I'd want to stay in here for a while.
I've got a group of 6 young people that I've identified as being the major burglars in my area. They've done probably 50 to 100 burglaries, and not just in my area. Apparently they've done it all over the lower North Island, burglaries. They're going to tell me all about it. And they said, can you help us? Can you help us get us a job? Can you occupy our time? We've got nothing better to do with our time. We don't have any money.
By the mid-90s, more than half the unemployed had been on the dole for 6 months or more, and many of them had given up even trying to find a job.
Every time you look for a job, you can't get one. I've been looking for a while.
How long?
Maybe about 6 years now.
I'm nearly 54. Where am I going to get a job? Especially when you're not skilled and all these people are getting the sack in these times.
Treasury and Reserve Bank wanted them out there looking for jobs and keeping wages down. A solution was provided by the new head of the Social Welfare Department, Margaret Baisley. Her approach to the long-term unemployed was based on an idea advocated by a right-wing American social theorist, Lawrence Mead. It was called helping and hassling.
We have always designed the systems that we want for this country that fits our society and our culture and our particular needs.
People would be helped to go job hunting, and if they didn't, they risked being punished.
We don't control the economy, we can't control how many jobs are out there, but we can help people get the skills that they need to make their lives better and hopefully to become independent. It's about giving people confidence and helping them to take that first step.
One tactic which sprang up around the mid-90s was to get beneficiaries to sign up under the guise of a contract to undertakings which each person would agree to do. For example, the department might agree to pay a benefit for a particular amount of time as long as the beneficiary could prove that they had knocked on X number of employers' doors.
While social welfare concentrated on the long-term unemployed, Treasury developed plans to increase the quality and quantity of people looking for work.
No longer do we want people just sitting there on the dole, making no progress, really wasting their lives and destroying their future.
The dole was scrapped for under 18-year-olds. Youth training schemes were increased.
It'll give the kids much more incentive to think about their options, particularly those at risk who are currently unemployable or in the future might be unemployable, will become employable.
Solo parents with children over 14 and husbands and wives of unemployed people would now have to search for work if directed. Treasury officials calculated that these policies would push another 60,000 people onto the already crowded labour market.
Don't panic, plenty of time and we've got plenty of forms.
Well, the basic effect is that you've got more people chasing every job, especially at the lower end of the wage spectrum. And if you've got an extra 30 or 40 or 50,000 people out there hunting up jobs in supermarkets and restaurants and in the forests and everywhere else, it's obviously going to put pressure on wages. And that's going to lower wage costs and dampen inflation. The flip side, though, of course, is that it also lowers incomes. But, of course, if your sole objective is to control inflation, you're not terribly worried about the personal and social consequences of that.
The government continued reducing tariff and import protection for New Zealand manufacturers.
If a pair of underpants costs you 20 cents now and they're imported from Taiwan, they're going to be reduced by 15%. Over the next 5 years, they're going to be 15% cheaper, aren't they?
Shirts for policemen and women were no longer made in New Zealand. It was cheaper to have them made in Indonesia.
What's the government up to? Why are they letting these orders leave the country? They know what it's going to do to businesses, clothing industry and whatnot. They know that it's taking the work away from the workers, and there's plenty of people out there that need jobs. So what are they doing? Why are they doing that to us?
At Summit Wool Spinners in Oamaru, workers were told wages would be cut by 12%.
We were constantly told that if we didn't accept the wage cuts, that cut our hours of work, that they would that there was a big possibility or a danger of the mill closing.
600 of Oamaru's workers were on the dole and looking for work. Summit staff had no choice but to accept the pay cut.
Suddenly I was at work for an extra 12 or even 24 hours a week to make that same amount of money that we had before. In some cases, people were unable to work those longer hours, so it meant they had less money coming in. There was less money to pay for school uniforms, less money to buy clothes for the kids or toys for Christmas.
Since the 50s, import restrictions had been used to keep Kiwis at work in car assembly factories. Now, tariff protection was completely removed.
It means, of course, that this plant cannot continue to operate with no tariff protection.
Oh yeah, very sad day. Lose a lot of friends.
Yeah, and sick in the stomach, really. People of my age, how am I going to get a job?
The car assembly industry was closed down. 6,000 jobs were lost. The assembly machinery stripped out of New Zealand factories was shipped to Africa and India. The wages of low-income workers had been dropping towards the benefit level set in 1991. Once again, the gap between work and welfare had narrowed. And once again, Treasury officials suggested there should be new incentives for the unemployed to search for work.
What has this got to do with prices, people ask themselves. Well, what must have been amazing to people is that the government tried it. What must have been more amazing to people is that it's worked. We've had price stability since December 91.
The 1991 benefit cuts had pushed many unemployed people below the poverty line. This time, Treasury proposed modest tax relief for low-paid workers and a new family tax credit.
Low and middle income working people are the backbone of the nation. The government in this program has fully protected all the benefits of people on welfare. In addition, we have greatly enhanced the reward available to them when they move into the workforce.
The family tax credit is a payment per child per week of $15 to low-income families, but it's highly discriminatory. It only goes to the children of those parents who meet the definition of being independent from the state. It's a policy that is designed to punish people who lose their jobs and then find they have to go on a benefit. Their children will miss out on this tax credit.
It's sort of a typical place that we come and visit. We're actually in Aotearoa, but it is quite usual for us to be visiting and doing dressings of people in garages.
What are the kind of illnesses you can get living in these conditions?
Things like rheumatic fever, more prone to pneumonia, asthma, bronchitis because of the damp conditions that they live in.
What I see here and what I'm treating is mainly the effects of poverty. I've got a family at the moment who are tuberculosis positive, meningitis in the developed world, the highest rates are in New Zealand. Those are all diseases of poverty.
In 1996, 473 New Zealanders went to hospital with chronic rheumatic heart disease. Most were young adults or children. 1 in 4 of them died of the disease.
It's a disgrace that we have so much rheumatic fever in New Zealand because we're a relatively wealthy country. We have a high enough standard of living that if conditions were more or less uniform throughout the country, we'd have almost none.
After 13 years of free market economic management, New Zealanders still hadn't fully accepted that low inflation was more important than full employment. In 1997, the Department of Social Welfare set about changing public opinion.
In 1940, 8% of New Zealanders were on benefits. Now, 24% of us are on benefits. These benefit payments cost us $5 million every working hour. That's $3 every hour from every worker every working day.
2 primetime TV documentaries dealt with a problem called welfare dependency.
I am one of those 250,000 kids whose sole provider is the welfare state. Whose sole provider is the welfare state. They say that 32 cents in every tax dollar is spent on the benefits. But where is it getting us?
We'd never thought of welfare like that before. That really changed in the 1990s, didn't it, about how we thought about the welfare society. I mean, we were quite proud of it up until that point, and then suddenly it became a tremendous burden to us. But a classic propaganda, which is always there to correct or to fill a gap, things you didn't know about, like bad things you didn't know about the enemy. Here's the propaganda to cover it, and it was a classic piece of propaganda.
The second episode put forward a solution to this new problem.
I think the case for privatization was really made in Wisconsin. Since the governor began privatizing the system in 1987, the caseloads have dropped by almost 1/2.
I just got them, and I don't have any income right now.
Okay. So here's how it works. We have, within 30 days from today, you have to put in 60 hours of employment search activities.
You are mandated as a welfare recipient to participate in the state job service program. And what that means is every day, from here on out, every day you have to go to the job service center.
Okay, well, the jobs do you have open?
Neither episode of Time Bomb examined why there was more poverty and more beneficiaries.
No, but there couldn't be, because, first of all, that would have been a criticism of current economic policy of the current government. And secondly, it was better portrayed as a social and moral problem because that fitted in with the rest of the treatment of beneficiaries at that time. If you look at the newspapers and you see how the way, for instance, data matching, the social welfare's data matching programs are treated by the media, you'll see that the beneficiaries were being characterised as a lower class, something separate, that didn't have the rights and the entitlements of ordinary people.
Income Support has a team of 104 investigators working hard to catch benefit fraudsters. Last year, we carried out 74,271 fraud investigations. We uncovered $64 million in stolen benefit money. Yesterday, our benefit crime line rang 89 times. If you're ripping off the benefit, sooner or later, your number will come up.
The $64 million was not a measurement of fraud at all. It was merely the total amount of overpayments established by the Department's investigation unit. It had nothing to do with intent to defraud. It was aimed to create in the minds of the non-beneficiary public that benefit fraud was out of control, that people in receipt of benefits were out there ripping the system off. It was in order to gain public support for the government's welfare agenda, which was about reducing welfare provision.
Every household in the country was sent an information pack and a questionnaire. This was called the Social Responsibility Survey.
Should people who repeatedly seek emergency income support be made to have free budget advice? If so, at what point? I've been told of people who've gone to budget services and been told to buy things in bulk because it's cheaper. How can a person on a low income buy anything in bulk? And what's the point? Nobody wants a whopping big bag of carrots and nothing else for their week's groceries.
If someone can't manage their budget, why should more taxpayer money be handed out to people if they can't actually manage it?
Therefore, if they've got money managers available and it's not going to cost the country too much, therefore I think we should have that system in place.
I suspect that behind this thing is an agenda to cut social welfare even further, so I haven't decided whether I'll read things on it or ignore it completely.
It is the fault of those individuals at the bottom because of their inability to partake in the great brave new world we have, the great free enterprise user pays New Zealand. That if you're not able to participate in that freedom, as it is portrayed, then that is your problem and your fault. If I, on the other hand, am able to participate and get the benefits of that system, and then I'm all right, Jack, and I can get on with my life, I can sleep at night knowing that I'm not responsible for the plight of others, because it is their fault that they're in that situation, and it is my abilities and my attributes which have put me in the privileged position I am vis-à-vis those at the bottom.
Soon, all benefits and employment services were put under the control of one government department, Work and Income New Zealand.
It's really important that everyone in the organisation knows that this is a new culture. This is not the New Zealand Employment Service, it's not CEG, and it's certainly not income support. It is new and it is going to be different, but you don't form a new culture overnight.
Now, wherever possible, all beneficiaries, not just the unemployed, would be made to search for work. WINS called them in for interview. 34,000 sickness beneficiaries, solo mothers with children over the age of 6, 46,000 invalids and their spouses, superannuitants under the age of 65.
My vision is around those changes for customers, truly helping them to become independent and to get work. Let's be absolutely real about this. It's not just about keeping people busy, it's about enabling them to look after themselves, and that means work. If they're going to move out of dependency, that's what it's about.
Benefit conditions were tightened. Now, 3 doctors had to confirm that an invalid wasn't fit to work.
It's all very well to have a policy that forces people to find jobs, and to some extent it will force downward pressure on wages in the lower end of the labour market. But the problem in New Zealand has been lack of demand, the lack of proper jobs. So no amount of coercion actually deals with that problem.
In 1998, church leaders initiated a nationwide protest march to Parliament.
Under the present system, government is deliberately making things tougher and tougher for those on the lower levels.
Government has asked people to go out there and get jobs, but I would like them to create real jobs for our people.
I'd like to get back to a New Zealand we had, where every kid had a chance and people were housed properly, and there was adequate education and schooling for everyone, not just the rich.
Bruises Hikoi, we declare to the victims of the market, to those who are the homeless, who in this city tonight will sleep under bridges, sleep in cars, be evicted because the market rents can't be paid out of the benefits. We declare to you, we declare to the hungry, to those who will seek help in the food bank this day, to the children who are at school without a lunch, we declare to you that your voice will be heard. We declare to you that your hopes will be restored and that your life is not to be negotiated in the marketplace of the money changers. Enough is enough.
The government is determined to face up to the economic challenges that this nation faces.
Yeah, where's your round table stooges?
And we are prepared to work with any group who has solutions to offer.
It is a time to acknowledge that there is a growing gap between rich and poor in this country, and that we in this Parliament have a duty to do something about that.
– 12 months later, in November 1999, there was a general election.
139.
There we go. So how does it feel to be at this stage of the game? Feels good. No, it's going to be a great day, I think.
I would like you to please welcome Helen Clark, our very own MP for Mount Albert and New Zealand's first elected woman pioneer.
When I opened our campaign in the Auckland Town Hall a month ago, I said I felt I wasn't just launching a campaign, but a crusade, because I don't think the best values have guided us in New Zealand in the 90s, and I want to change that.
They're not measured on even a year.
Helen Clark appointed Michael Cullen Minister of Finance, and shortly after the election, he sat down and renewed the agreement with the Governor of the Reserve Bank.
This policy targets agreement is designed to send the signal, I think, of the bank moving further down the path it's been on over the last couple of years, which I think has been rather more beneficial in terms of some level of confidence within the business community and about the near to medium term future.
Inflation would average 2.5%, and on a typical day, some 100,000 New Zealanders would be out of work.